I would like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Omar H. Ali. Dr. Ali is the Dean of Lloyd International Honors College and Professor of Global and Comparative African Diaspora History in the UNC Greensboro College of Arts and Sciences. He is a historian of the African diaspora who explores the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds. Of East Indian and Peruvian descent, Dr. Ali is a graduate of the London School of Economics and Political Science and received his PhD in history from Columbia University. He has been a Fulbright Professor of History and Anthropology at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Bogotá, a visiting professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt University, and a library scholar at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He has appeared on CNN, NPR, PBS, and other media outlets. He gave a TEDx talk right here for TEDx Greensboro that was entitled, "What's in a Name? Islam, History, and Identity." Dr. Ali was named the Carnegie Foundation North Carolina Professor of the Year in 2016 and was appointed Knight of the Order of the Academic Palms by the French government in 2021 for his work with teachers around the world. And I myself have certainly benefited from his generosity in partnering with me at the library. So Dr. Ali, we are so honored to have you with us tonight, and we thank you for bringing together our panelists and for moderating our program.
Oh, thank you so much, Beth. I want to thank you for this invitation and for helping to organize this event, the Greensboro Public Library, the program in African American African Diaspora Studies, and our director there, Noelle Morissette, the Let's Learn Initiative, which is coordinated by Dan Friedman. With Lloyd International Honors College, but mostly I'm so honored and I feel so excited for all of us because we have the real pleasure of hearing from two dear colleagues and friends, Nodia Mena and Monica Carrillo. The music that you were listening to is actually Monica's work. She is a Grammy Award-winning artist and poet who I've known for many moons. We met, in Peru on a visit, and then in New York, and then she and I have collaborated some here in North Carolina. She just flew in from Peru, and she is forever helping and supporting other people in the community. She is really not just an award-winning artist, but a very important leader in Latin America, not just among the Latin American populations, but for all Latin Americans. And I think that I'm so thrilled that she's joining us this evening. And she served recently as a visiting scholar for Lloyd International Honors College and has presented at the CASE conference, which is the African American African Diaspora Studies conference we do every year. And we'll be giving out some information for folks later on, but it's a conference that will be next week on Tuesday and Wednesday, or was it Wednesday and Thursday, but next week. To say just also that she is a nonprofit leader, a human rights advocate. She is the founder and director of Lundu, which is basically an Afro-Peruvian community-based organization, but her work really is spread out across Latin America. Thank you for joining us. Vamos a hablar un poquito en español y inglés, so we'll mix it up. And I have the great pleasure of introducing Nodia Mena. Nodia is a dear colleague and also friend here from Greensboro. She is Garifuna, so she is both Indigenous or Native American descent and African descent from the Caribbean, specifically in Honduras. And she is currently a doctoral candidate in the Educational Leadership and Cultural Foundations program at UNC Greensboro. She has served as an ambassador for Garifuna and is somebody who I've had the pleasure of presenting in different spaces with, and I've just learned so much from her. And she's also currently serving as a secretary for the International Advisory Committee for the city of Greensboro supporting refugees, immigrant communities, including Latin American immigrant communities. So the way that we're going to do things in conversation, we talked about this, is I want to ask a very general question, and Nodia is going to present for about half an hour, a very sweeping presentation on Afro-Latin America. And then Monica is going to come in and add to the mix and deepen the conversation before we open things up for a little bit of question and answer. So if that's okay with everybody, if you give us a thumbs up there, I'm seeing all the thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, good. I'll say one thing, which is that for folks who are less familiar with Afro-Latin America, and Nodia is going to go into a great deal with that, is that this is an enormously important part of the global African diaspora. It is a combination of people who came from West and Central West Africa and parts of Southeast Africa over the course of several hundred years into what was Native American territories as a result of the Iberian imperial and colonial ventures that, and then later on British and others, that brought in most of the folks from Africa proper through the transatlantic slave trade. And those communities were resisting, and individuals from the moment of contact of enslavement or attempted efforts in Africa across the board, across the ships to here when folks landed. And in many places, there were free Black communities that were made up of Maroons, runaway slave communities. And it is the basis of much of the America's economy and culture and languages. And so we have to understand the vital importance of Afro-Latin America as part of the Americas and as part of world history, quite frankly. And we're celebrating Black History Month, and there are many connections to be made. I think that in traditionally Black History Month has focused mostly on North America, as is appropriate because we are here in North America in African American communities. And this is tied to a much larger history across the Americas. So we're thrilled that we're bringing this programming as part of Black History Month and the Greensboro Public Library in partnership with various entities. So with that, the big question is, why is it important to know about Afro-Latin America? And at this point, I will hand things to my dear colleague and friend, Nodia Mena.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Ali. I am honored to be here today. Muchas gracias por la invitación, Beth. Gracias por tenerme aquí. Es un gran honor estar presente y contribuir con ustedes esta noche. It is an honor to be here with all of you and bring a little bit of, perspective in regards to that parallel history between Afro-descendants in Latin America and in the United States. I have a presentation and I would like to go through it with you and let you know what I prepared. Just give me a moment to bring my screen. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Now, I will be talking to you about racial relations in Latin America. And just to give you a little bit of overview, I will talk to you a little bit about where I am from. Then we will go into the slave trade database, the geographical location of Afro-descendants in Latin America, Afro-descendants in Latin America, the heterogeneous configuration of race or racial relations in the region, the role of Afro-descendants play in the national economies and societies, and how they have been represented and visualized or not in the nation's statistics. So first, I'm going to talk to you about, what happened to my, okay. The first thing is, I want to tell you something in my native language, Garifuna. And what I want to share with you is, Kaimon Arabu, to pick up sugarcane, cassava, bebe, and icacos near the shore of my beautiful Trujillo Bay. I want to share to you where I am from. I am from the beautiful Bay Area of Trujillo, where we can pick up icacos right along the shore And what this does for me, these pictures are a great part of who I am, because it brings me these memories from when I was a little girl, and I will go to my grandma's farm, you know, to pick up, to help her in the farm. But then we will get there by walking along the shore, and we will pick up these fruits. You know, this is icaco and this is bebe. This is wild grapes, and we call it bebe in Garifuna. And of course, once we got to the farm, we will eat some gañesi. This is the way in which we call it in Garifuna. Gañesi is sugarcane, right? And it was so much fun for us to, you know, this excitement to just knowing that we will go to the farm and eat a little bit of gañesi. And then, of course, to do a little bit of work, helping our grandma, you know, to remove the weeds, weed out, you know, the yuca. This is yuga in Garifuna. And my grandma used to plant yuca because she used to make ereba, which is cassave. You probably know what cassave is, but it's a flatbread made out of cassava, is in English, but in Garifuna is yuga. In Spanish, it's also known as yuca. So this is where I'm from, and I wanted to share a little bit of my heart with you tonight. And now, without further ado, let's start a little bit with what it is that I want to talk to you about. Some of you may be familiar with this map. Those of you who know the answer, let's give a chance to those who want to get an opportunity to know what this is. I want to do this a little bit interactive. Maybe you guys can write a little something on the chat and as an answer to this question. But this is the transatlantic slave trade. And if anyone knows, more or less, what was the amount of enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas during the slave trade? Let's see. Does anyone know? You can place it on the chat. You can write a number on the chat, an estimation of any number. Okay, it was a total of around 12 million enslaved Africans. Now, let's see. I'm going to ask you another question and try and see, and you can write this down on the chat. What amount of, or what percentage of these enslaved Africans were brought to Latin America? Estimate. Let's see. 80%, someone say 80%, 35%, 75%. Well, I have news for you. 95% of this total number disembarked in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it was only about 5% that disembarked in the United States. So the question you may be asking is, so what happened? Why is it that Afro-descendants are not as visible in Latin America as they are here in the United States? Well, there is a history, and that is what I'm here to tell you, to talk to you about, right? What has happened? Because as we continue, we can see that there are approximately 133 million Afro-descendants in Latin America compared to 46.8 million people who identify as Black in the United States. This is a big difference, right, in regards to the amount of Afro-descendants and the lack of visibility that there is in for Afro-descendants in Latin America. As you can see, this map, the data I have on the right is more recent. This data was taken from 2015. And there are approximately 91% of the total Afro-descendants live in Brazil. And there are approximately 105 million Afro-descendants in the whole country of Brazil. Then Venezuela is in second place, 17 million, 5 million in Colombia. then 1.2 million in Ecuador, 1.2 million in Cuba. And as you can see, the rest of the countries have fewer than 1 million Afro-descendants. Now, I was playing around a little bit with data and found out that in North Carolina, the whole state of North Carolina, there are approximately 1,118,596 Hispanic and Latinos. And out of this, it could be estimated, this is how the World Bank works, it's estimated that 25% are Afro-descendants, which means that 279,649 Afro-descendants live in the state of North Carolina. And this is according to the 2020 census. Now, it is important to understand that Afro-descendants, right, there has been it's been a little bit difficult to collect data as in regards to who is Afro-descendant and who's not, because the term Afro-descendant encompasses a variety of terms throughout all Latin America. Many Afro-descendants identify as Negro, Moreno, Pardo, Sambo, Cimarrón, Mulatto, Tercerón, Preto, Creole. And what's happening with these terms, right? During the African diaspora, and because of what I will be talking to you a little bit later on, that these were racial categories. And sometimes it denotes people's perception of race and miscegenation. And rather than group identities, and more often than not have attached stigmas and biases derived from a history of discrimination and racism in Latin America. So all of these names, all of these categories that you can see here, they have a negative connotation attached to it, depending on which country you are in. Now, the implication of being perceived as Afro-descendant have different categories describing lighter skin color or mixed race origin. And it can often be used to soften the discriminatory implications of identifying a person as Black or Afro-descendant. So as you can see this palette here, this is what happened in Latin America, and it is called colorism, right? Some people prefer to identify themselves based on the pigmentation of their skin rather than identifying themselves as Black. Now, there is the consequences on these histories of discrimination and racism are visible today in the United States, right? In terms of their economic development, as well as their current social arrangements, especially when it comes to obtaining access to basic quality of life. But then it is also true to Latin America. The processes that began during the colonial era are highly relevant for understanding the heterogeneous configuration of racial relations in the region in Latin America, and the role Afro-descendants play in the national economies and societies, and the way we have been presented and visualized or not visualized in Latin America. All of that comes from the colonial ideology, and I will tell you a little bit more about this colonial ideology, and it has a lot to do with castas. What is castas? This was a Spanish and Portuguese term used during the 17th and 18th century, mainly in the Spanish America, to describe as a whole the mixed race people, which appear in the post-conquest period. Now, this is a complex caste system because it was used for social control and also to determine the person's importance in society. There were a few, main categories of race in Latin America. One was the Spanish, the Spaniard born in Spain. Then it was Criollo, which was the mix of, or the one that was the child of a European but born in the New World, the Americas. And then India or Indio, a person who is descendant of the original inhabitants of the Americas. And then it was Negro, which was a person Black, African descent, usually a slave, or their free descendants. So el sistema de castas, it placed non-whites on an inferior legal and social status. Whiteness was the index of honor and value. And they were the ones who had access or were entitled to individuals, to public office, to recognition, and to wealth. Now, this gave way to different categories, which I will be talking to you about today, the way in which it was identified, that the way people used to identify during the colonial period, which was the slavery period, slavery. And then it was, after that, there were a phenomenon that happened, and then they started with the theory of blanqueamiento. And then after blanqueamiento, there was another period, and then mestizaje. And after mestizaje, then it began the multiculturalism and the return to Blackness. And I will tell you a little bit more about that. Now, the colonial ideology, right? It was one in which it created this stigma toward Blackness. And I have a little bit, a sample here of a little bit of an announcement on one of the media used during that time, where they're announcing, se vende una negra criolla. They're selling a Black criolla. She's young, es joven, sana y sin tacha. She's healthy and she's pure. Con alguna inteligencia, some intelligence, right? The way in which it's being described, some intelligence to wash clothes and to iron clothes. But she's excellent, muy excelente para manejar niños, for the amount of 500 pesos. In contrast, right, there's the announcement, in contrast to that one, with the se vende un hermoso caballo. So they're selling a stallion. This is hermoso, right? Beautiful, de bonita estampa. And it's the start to describe the horse. So this is a comparison of how much more precious was the life of an animal than it was the life of a Black person. So while racial laws in Spanish and Portuguese colonies tended to be more flexible in practice than in theory, and it increased the number of free Blacks, right? So there was a moment in which Blacks were allowed to mix. So they will have children with Indigenous people, but rarely would you see a Black person marrying a white person. And mixed race descendants, Afro-descendants were systematically relegated to the bottom of the social scale. They experienced little social mobility and faced extreme forms of deprivation. So the ascription to casta implied not only civil and religious rights, but also determining aspects of taxation, limits on public and religious office, travel restrictions, property. So a Black person was not allowed to have property. So the African slaves were forced to work on the sugar plantations, and the scale of the slave trade was such that only 50 years after the establishment of the colony, of the Spanish colony in Mexico, whites were already outnumbered, not only by the native indigenous population, but also by the Africans they brought with them. So who would have thought about the fact that there was a point in which in Mexico, non-whites were the majority of the population. So the colonial Latin America became predominantly non-white, but it was brutally ruled by a small white elite. This trend continued throughout the colony, so that 3 centuries later, the early 1800s, Afro-descendants still constituted 67% of the population in Brazil, 67% of the population in Panama, and 61% in Venezuela. Now, imagine Latin America with less white people, more indigenous, and more white. What is that the recipe for? What is going to happen later? So Unlike in the United States, racial laws in Spanish and Portuguese colonies tended to be more flexible. However, Afro-descendants were systematically relegated to the bottom of the social scale. So there had to be a systematic way in which they could continue, or in which white people could continue to present themselves as being better than. And I know that we are in the United States, and you can start establishing parallels between that situation in Latin America and the one here in the United States, right? It may appear that the story is different or the history is different, but it is along the same lines. Now, by the 1830s, most countries in Latin America had gained independence from the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Now, white elites preserved the privileged status. Political participation was reserved for literate, wealthy men, which left non-whites out of the decision-making process throughout the whole Latin America. Now, what is going to happen next when now the dominion of Europeans is no longer part of the politics in Latin America? Now, what happened next is that there was a systemic way in which they had to find a way in which non-whites wouldn't continue to be the majority. So they started the process of blanqueamiento, or whitening. Blanqueamiento is a set of policies, discourses, and practices built on the idea that white and European elements were superior to African or indigenous ones. It was widely adopted during the second half of the century, right after Independencia. So the historical configuration of race relations is therefore important to understanding the current patterns and perceptions, not only of race, but also of racial discrimination in Latin America. These immigration policies of the time encouraged European migrants to settle in the continent as a means of progressively whitening the population. So in Uruguay, there was a moment in 1925 where the government said, oh, we are of total European origin, in spite of the fact that non-whites were the majority in that country. And many other countries also adopted that same policy. Now, the theories of blanqueamiento started falling into disuse from the 1930s onward as a result of the emergence of new paradigms in the racial ideologies, sustaining the status quo across the region, mainly because of the post-revolutionary Mexican national elites, who began shifting from ideologies of whitening in favor of narratives that emphasize harmonious race relations, representing in the celebration of mestizo, or the mixed blood, the composition. This was going to be the new composition of the whole nation, right? Mestizaje. Mestizaje then inferred the ideologies that position whiteness as a superior category by redefining the mestizo as Latin America. In other words, whiteness was no longer the prime aspiration. They were thinking more that, oh, mestizaje now is gonna take that place, right? Mestizos are gonna take that role. No longer whiteness, mestizos are gonna be now at the top. So it was the public perception of Latin America increasingly embraced the notion that all citizens were of mixed race. The absence of like a Jim Crow kind of law segregation and the lack of institutionalized racial categories created the sense that Latin America society lived in racial harmony, right? So politicians, intellectuals, and artistic elites reiterated the value of racial mixing, synthesized in popular books such as La Raza Cósmica de Vasconcelos, where he publicly proclaimed that everyone was mestizo. There was nothing else, mestizo nada más. And then the Mansión en the Shanties, which was from Gilberto Freire, and the Cuban counterpoint, the Fernando Ortiz, he's Cubano. So all of these intellectuals proclaimed that there was no racismo, there was no there was no racist ideas, and that mestizo was the national identity, right, of Latin America. Gilberto Freire went as far as to coin the term of racial democracy as a way of depicting Brazil's racial relations. In his book, The Mansión of the Shanties, La Mansión de los Shanties, Freire claimed that in Brazil, segregation was absent. Slavery had been more benign, and racial mixing was publicly celebrated. Although subsequent studies debunked many of his claims, his work has been influential, deeply influential, in shaping public perceptions about ethno-racial groups and Afro-descendants to the present. Now, Mexico is a very good example of how mestizo national projects have contributed to invisibilizing Afro-descendants. By the 18th century, Mexico had received the largest number of slaves in the Americas, around 200,000, mainly through the port of Veracruz along the Gulf of Mexico. Post-revolutionary Mexican government promoted an ideology of mestizaje centered on the glorification of the pre-colonial indigenous past. Blackness was erased from the Mexican national image. Even as recently as 1996, report submitted on behalf of the Mexican state to the United Nations claimed that racism was non-existent in the country and that the majority of the Mexican population was mestizo, but mestizo meaning indigenous and white, nothing black, right? Blackness did not exist. And on the other hand, right, mestizaje was imagined as a path that would lead toward a future of progress and modernity, but that future continued to be associated with whiteness and European style development. Indigenous people, Afro-descendants were routinely associated with the past, the tradition, the folklore, while whiteness continued to symbolize the modern world to which Latin America societies aspire. I know you guys are starting to make parallels as to, oh, I know another country where this happens, right? So this is an effort in promoting color blindness, right? Very clearly promoting color blindness. So by promoting this color blindness, the idealized worldview of racial democracies contributed to silencing and discrediting critiques of rampant racial inequalities. Mestizaje reinforced the idea that ethno-racial relations in Latin America did not require any kind of attention or reform, a view that is still dominant today. And it constitutes one of the major obstacles hindering the endorsement of policies targeted to Afro-descendants. But what are the arguments? The arguments are attempts to visualize racial differentiation were increasingly seen as counter to the national discourse of progress and unity. Another argument, visualizing race was often characterized as inciting racism. And then statistical institutes throughout the region started dropping race variables in their census and other statistical tools. And then by the 1960s, only 2 countries kept reporting on their Afro-descendants population, which was Brazil and Cuba. They succeeded for a little bit. And I will show you, this graph where there was a point in which Afro-descendants did not identify as such because of all that effort, right? The mestizaje and all of that. So Afro-descendants living in countries that adopt the mestizaje ideologies started ascribing to mixed race categories, such as Moreno, Pardo, and many others, because these categories offer them a space to escape the stigma of belonging to racial categories that were historically discriminated against, such as negro or negro or preto or prieto. By 1930s onward, to be a person of African ancestry in Latin America increasingly meant to be brown rather than black. right? It was better, it was best to identify as brown. In Brazil, for example, the population identified themselves as Black and the census declined, as you can see here on the graph. In not only in Brazil, in many other countries, right? Anyone identifying as Black, it declined, that number declined. But then, as you can see on this graph as well, something happened, right? There were some movements. And then it gave way to multiculturalism. So by the 1980s, as democracies spread across Latin America, Afro-descendants, social movements, and indigenous organizations pushed for the recognition of their rights as distinct and neglected segments of the population, right? States began adopting aspects of multicultural citizenship, which favored the recognition of cultural difference and the rights of ethno-racial groups. So this shift to multiculturalism was a breakpoint for Afro-descendants because it marked the first time in history that the region engaged them, not just as individual, but as a social group bearing collective rights as a common history of displacement and exclusion. And these were some of the laws that were created as to protect the rights of Afro-descendants in Latin America. ILO, Indigenous Tribal Peoples Convention. This is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and Intersectoral Policies and Agreements, and many other policies that were created to protect the rights of Afro-descendants. So in the years that followed, the work of Afro-descendants movement led many countries to approve laws protecting the rights of people of African descent, including laws to protect them from all forms of racism and discrimination, as well as the recognition of their land rights and cultural heritage. So Afro-descendant social movements have challenged also the negative stereotypes around Blackness and have encouraged mixed race people to recognize their African roots and heritage. So this reaffirmation of Afro-descendants' identities and rights also had a statistical impact on the number of identifying as mixed race. So just to fast forward, those who did not identify as Afro-descendant before, increasingly after the year 2000, started increasingly to identify their Afro-descendancy. So now, right, there is much, much more work to do. This Afro-descendant as a complex category because of the complexity of the history, right? Including the different euphemisms, the historical configuration of Blackness, and the changing patterns of ethno-racial classification. We have more work to do. So at the base of Afro-descendants are also in the process of incorporating the implications of ascribing or not to historically stigmatized categories, including ethno-racial variables and statistical tools. Is not enough to revert decades of centuries of invisibilization. Afro-descendants organizations and governments must work hard to make the inclusion of these variables relevant, not just numbers, but also work towards equity and equality in Latin America for Afro-descendants. And thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so very much. And that was a very rich overview of the history and the culture and the politics. And I really appreciated how you talk about the active invisibilization. I'm not even sure if that's the word, but making invisible the people of African descent and Blackness in particular. So next, what we're going to go to, you're getting a lot of thank yous and yeses in the chats there. We're going to go to Monica, and Monica has been really a pioneer in Peru, but in her impact on other parts of Latin America in terms of pushing for some of these very rights in terms of not just creating community services, but also fighting this in the courts. And the way I actually first met Monica was actually on a PBS documentary on Blackness and Blacks in Latin America, which was narrated by Henry Louis Gates at Harvard. And, and she was shown in her office in Lundu and the kind of work that she was doing. And I've just been tremendously impressed. I think anybody who's met Monica is impressed by just her grace and her experience and breadth of sort of knowledge. So this is going to be really great to kind of go into a discussion building on your presentation, Nodia. So with that, Monica.
Thank you very much for these nice words, Omar, and I am very honored to have the opportunity to talk to you and to everybody here in this panel. And thanks, Nodia, for sharing this interesting experience and also walking through the history and the complexities of the colonialisms in Latin America. I think something that I would like to address, and it's related to what just Nodia mentioned, is the characteristics of the colonialisms were different. The Anglo colonialism was different than the Portuguese, than the French. And I think that is something that has shaped our region. Even if we can be together, we have a lot of similarities. There are some cultural aspects, but also aspects that are related to the power, how we relate each other, what are the power relationships in our countries that are really based on this colonialist structure that are very unique, you know, from each kind of group. No? In this case, like, as I say, Portugal is different than Spain and than England. No? So that is something that, especially for the students or people that are trying to do research, to remember that we are different, not just because we speak a different language, but there are a lot of implications and things that are more subtle that is important to be aware when we analyze Latin America. The second thing, as I always say, I'm repeating that, but I would like to repeat that again. In the case of us, that we are Afro-descendants from the South America, of course, we are like 133 million. But for example, in my case, I am coming from Peru, and Peru, we are from the Pacific area, no? As Nodia showed in the map, no? South America, we have the Pacific and we have the Atlantic. So the transatlantic trade, people arrived, or Africans arrived to the markets in Cartagena, Uruguay, Bahia. But in order to arrive to the Pacific area, you need to do a U, no? Because you have the Amazon and the Andes as a barrier. So that is something that is important to remember, because people were mixed and they have this second trip, this second diaspora. And some scholars like Heidi Feldman quoted that concept of second diaspora. But we really feel that in our daily lives, no? Especially if you are in the Pacific region, because when we hear a lot about Cuba, that people can be connected to the Ifa or the Yoruba culture, is because, you know, they have kind of this possibility, at least, you know, that you were not able to return to Africa, but you know that you came through the Atlantic, no, to that sea. In our case, we don't have this kind of memory, you know, because the sea is really walking to Japan or Asia. And the second component is that because of this mixogenization and combination of different African ethnicities, we lost some elements of our languages and religions. No? That is the second component. The third component, specifically for Peru and Bolivia, is that we were located mainly in the coast. Our coast in Peru is a very dry area, it's a desert. Lima is the second biggest capital in a desert after Egypt. So it's just, you can have an idea how dry is Lima, but also the sub area where we are. We have a valley, but mainly because Incas, pre-Incas, they were able to conquer the valley and create an irrigation systems. Otherwise, maybe we wouldn't have a valley in that area. So why I am mentioning that? Because the experience related to that cimarronaje, or to creating communities of Africans who escaped from the hacienda, that was possible to do in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Colombia, because of the Amazon and the geography. That experience was not possible to do in the area where I am coming from, which is a desert. We have also palenques and cimarrones, but people were more like, ended up like living more in an itinerant way and helping other Africans to escape, but they were always on the road. They were not able to create this enclosed community because, of course, you have just a lot of horizonte to be trapped easily. That that element that I mentioned, the second diaspora and the geography, are very important to understand why we are very different, no? I can connect that with something else that maybe is more related to the connection with the US, related to the Afro-Latinos in the US. Okay, we have the Andeans Afro-Latinos, people from the Andes. We have the Afro-Caribbean. In the Caribbean, we have people that speak Spanish. We have also Garifunas. And we have also people here in the US. So why it's important to remember that we can work together is because we have a lot of points in common as members of people of the African diaspora. So that identity, even if we speak a different language, even if we have a different culture, we share a common experience that is giving us a lot of opportunity to design strategies together. This is why it's important to remember that Latino is not a race. Latino is a category that exists when we migrate to the US or to Europe. But if you are in Latin America, I am pretty sure that nobody will define themselves as Latino. If you ask my mom, my cousin, my friends in Brazil, they never call themselves Latino. They can call, oh, I am from the Caribbean, I am from the Andes, I am from the Atlantic, but they never call themselves Latino. Latino is like a box created based on in the experience of migration. So it's very important for us when we're talking about Latinos, always openly ask, what are you talking about Latinos? What are the ethnicity of these Latinos? What are the relations of power of these Latinos? Because the point is, like, we also migrate with our racisms. And if you are here in the US, no, I have been working a lot in New York, in Queens, no, you can see how even if you can be undocumented, even if you can, you know, are like just struggling every day, you can repeat and reproduce the same caste, no, system that Nodia mentioned it in the Latino community. No? So that is something that is important to acknowledge. I know that it doesn't sound good, but I am Latina, so I can talk about my people. But at the same time, I have discovered and realized that a lot of opportunities, for example, me as an Afro-Peruvian, to work together with Mexicans and with Ecuadorians that are coming more from indigenous background, because we understand that we are sharing this Latino identity, no? Which is also positive and that we embrace here in the US. No? So it's just more like, just always like I say, remember that Latino is not race, and we need to ask, no, what kind of Latinos we are. The second idea is that maybe it could be interesting is, especially in the last year and last 2 years with the movement, the Black movement here in the US, that speak out against the police brutality, no? We saw that there was like more space to discuss Blackness in the US, and also interest in establishing alliance with Latinos here and in Latin America. So something that I think I was reflecting a lot was about the use of some languages. For example, here in the US, it's very common to talk about Black liberation, no? Or el abolicionismo, no? That is in many ways related to the incarceration of Black people, that also is kind of a reproduction or an extension of the slavery system, no? Because all the reasons that we know that are structural. Okay, when we talk with people from Latin America that live in Latin America and translate the word abolicionismo or Black liberation, for example, like I am pretty sure that many people in our context will connect immediately with the idea of being maroons, cimarrones, these communities that escape from the hacienda and create their own communities. This is something that immediately you will think about Black liberation, no? So what I am mentioning that is because if we are here in the US, if we want to talk with Latin America or about Latin America, it's not necessarily enough to do a translation of a term, because maybe Black abolition for us or Black liberation means something different. Positive as well, but different, because our experience is really different. No? That is something that I think I identify. It's just come up, people say like a cultural switch, no? But translation is no, it's important to do that interpretation. Something that I also see now people are using more here, brown color, not brown, like brown. there are some movements or like people in the US that are describing the mixed or the Afro-descendant movement in Latin America also as people of color and brown. So now in Latin America, people are using the term like marrón. It's more something that people are borrowing that term from the US, but it's kind of creating like a new wave of discussion, because really historically we never call ourselves marrón, no, because we don't have this kind of colorisms in that way that we have here in the US, no? So I am not saying that it's right or good or bad, but just I want to just share that this exchange of terms is something that now is on the plate, and the movement in Latin America, and here we are discussing and embracing some terms and taking decisions if you like or if you don't like. But that kind of thing can impact our movement as well, can impact how we negotiate things in terms of public policy. Are we going to include a marrón categoría in Spanish when we are describing the vulnerable groups that they should be included in a law? What does it mean to use the term marrón? So that is something that could also open a door that could be maybe positive, or maybe we are not ready for that moment and we just need to keep just using Afro-descendants or Afro-Colombians. No? That is kind of why this discussion is very important. The second main idea, I think that I would like to talk connected to Nodia is the mestizaje. Why mestizaje is the project of Latin America, no? It's because it's the main, like, or the biggest ethnic group in Latin America. They were the Indigenous. We have the Amazon. The Amazon is shared by 9 countries. We have also the Andes. So when Spaniards and Portuguese, they arrived, even if they tried, they were not able to eliminate the people. So that strategy was, okay, we have white here, black here, and the Indigenous are in the center. So we need to mix to conquer, because otherwise they won't be able to succeed. So this is why the mestizaje has been a project. And for example, something that we realized recently, a few years ago in Peru, we were able, the movement, no, advocated for the inclusion of a racial and ethnic category in the intake forms in the hospital. So if you are going to any hospital now, the intake form has a question about your ethnicity. Before we didn't have that. But the problem is, like, in the hospitals, you know, after 1 year, we were very excited. Oh, now we have data. And communities that they were obviously like black, you just see that 100% were mestizos. And we say, oh, what's going on? What happened? No? I did a research about that for the Ministry of Women. And I identified that there was like a policy of the director, of many directors of the hospital, telling everybody, you just should use the category mestizo. And the question is why? One reason is because they didn't have resources to process the information, because if they include more categories, they should have a budget to process that information. In many cases, it's like a manual systematization, no? Because not all the hospital has a computer, so they didn't want to complicate the process. But the second one, that was maybe the main, is like they feel embarrassed to ask a racial question, because that could offend the person. They didn't want to offend. They didn't want to be aggressive, because many of these people working in the hospital, they thought that asking a question about race is something racist. And I guess this is the game, no, that has been using for the groups of people that are embracing this idea of racial democracy. No, so you cannot talk about race because you are going to be racist or express racism. So this is why, for example, with my organization, I am not the director right now, but I was a former director. But one project that I did a few years ago was the inclusion or advocating for the inclusion of the racial and ethnic category in the intake forms of when you report gender violence. So we were able to achieve that after 3 years of advocacy in all the centers that are ruled by the Ministry of Women, where people are reporting gender violence. but we also included the racist insult as a category of psychological violence. No? And what I am saying that because using and after reflecting about what happened with the Ministry of Health and with the hospitals, we redesigned a strategy where we include also training to the workers, to the people who are receiving the gender violence report, first to explore with them why they would feel embarrassed or uncomfortable, but also explaining their why it's important to have data. So maybe as a summary of these strategies, something that I would like to acknowledge is the transformation in terms of public policy is proportional to the force of the movement. No, so usually the government just won't like stare, say, oh, now I want to change, I want to transform the society because this is something related to power, no? But there is always a chance to do something if you work in different layers, no? Negotiate, but also you can be strong, no? And this is something that we can do here in the US as well, because there is very important to have differentiated information about Afro-Latinos. Just Nodia show us a very interesting data about how many Afro-Latinos are. So just knowing how many Afro-Latinos are in North Carolina, maybe we can start a program, no? But we need to have the information and we can have the opportunity to design something new. I can stop now, I think.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. There were, yes, multiple comments in the chat. One of them was noting, just to build off of your comment about Nodia's numbers, extrapolating from the population of Latinos in the state or Latinx. And there's, again, these are terms that are sort of changing, you know, from year to year, is about almost the population of Greensboro. So it's a large number of people. Just in North Carolina alone. I was taken by your comment, Monica, about how Latino is created in the experience of migration, and that's both free and forced migration. And I was thinking that we use as human beings shortcuts to navigate our environments, our spaces, and but as you're pointing out, there's real diversity within Latin America, within Afro-Latin Americans, and I think about the diversity within Africa itself, you know, and I think that sometimes we lump groups together, and I think it's for good, and also it can be sometimes not good in the sense that it can overly simplify and water down distinctions that are very meaningful. And I was thinking that forums like this, these kind of roundtables, are an opportunity for us to continue to get to know each other and learn each other's histories, because the histories are very, very rich. It is 8:07 right now, and I wanted to give our audience participants a chance to ask some questions. I'm just going to point out that Raquel Holmes was talking about how racial insults as psychological violence. And I think that, you know, violence takes many, many forms. There's physical violence, but there's also the kind of violence that's day to day. And the words are part of the violence that are sometimes perpetrated against groups of people to keep them disempowered and less visible. So with that, let's open things up. If you have a question, why don't you put it in the chat, and Nodia and Monica can respond as they wish. So the floor is open, if you will, for questions. Folks may want to take just a few seconds to think about it and write. Nodia, did you have any comments in response while we're waiting for some questions to come in to what Monica was laying out for us?
I think it's super interesting what Monica said in regards to accountability when it comes to how we create those hierarchies amongst ourselves, right? What you were saying, Monica, on how Latinos tend to also create those different layers of discrimination amongst the same group. It's interesting because I think some of it is a result of misinformation, and as you said at the end, towards the end, how we can create something in North Carolina, regardless of the space, the location in which we are, and try to form these coalitions in order to start, disseminating this information, which is so highly important, not only for people who are not from Latin America, but also amongst ourselves. I'm sure there is information from the different countries in Latin America in regards to Afro-descendants that people in those countries don't know, So it is super important to, what you said was very important to point out.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have come in. I'll start with, there was one in the Q&A from Raquel. Why the shift towards mestizos? Was it to support themselves or was there a change in the political structure? So that's the question again, is why was there a shift towards mestizos? Do you want to respond to that, Nodia?
Yes, of course. And it was more because, as we had said earlier, there was a point in which the majority was non-white, right? And then after the independence, and I think I need to expand a little bit more in regards to independence, during the colonial period, Latin America was ruled by the kings of Spain and Europe, right? So it was el reinado, and Latin American governors would receive orders from the king and the queen. After 1830, which was between 1820 and 1830, was the period of independence. These countries decided, well, we no longer want to be ruled by Europe. We want to have our own government. And then the revolution started, right, after that period. And after the revolution, the majority were mixed, just white and indigenous. The shift was more than political, was mainly because of the need to create an identity for Latin America. After being ruled by Europe, they needed to create an identity, but they didn't want Blackness to be part of that identity. And that's part of what the research that I gather, mainly because they wanted to disconnect themselves from the rule of Latin America, of Europe, and create this sense of identity and make it to a point where the same way in which whitening had been the project, right, and bringing all these white Europeans to Latin America. Now, since it seems that there wasn't much of a success because of, once again, the complex ways in which race occurs. Imagine there were people who were Black but lighter skin. They were able to purchase a certificate that stated that they were white, and that was signed by the king and queen in Europe. So all of these complex ways in which this effort for creating a national identity was happening, that's why there was this effort, this project. Well, to prevent all of that from happening, we do not want to continue to sell white certificates. Let's just create the idea that everyone is mestizo without having anything to do with Blackness, because Blackness is associated with everything that is bad.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to give Monica a chance if she wanted to elaborate, but I did see a connection with, in terms of American, that is North American, U.S. history, and sort of the effort, because almost like mestizaje was almost a national effort to try to create something separate from the colonial power, which was Spain, Brazil, with Portugal. And that you see a little bit of that parallel in terms of American history and sort of not just the racial codification of slavery, but the ways in which whiteness becomes tied to citizenship and in very explicit ways in the law. So, but Monica, was there anything that you wanted to add? And we'll go to one other question.
Just quickly add that even before the idea of mestizo in Latin America in Peru that I can talk about that. We use the idea of el criollo. Criollo was like Creole, but in that context of Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, was someone who can be like white and maybe has a mother who can be half indigenous or half black. But the idea of el criollo is kind of like a caste that they were not born in Spain, they were born in Peru or in Latin America, but they wanted to have the rights that people or the Europeans had. So this is what, as Nodia said, they create their own category. And they were interacting or working or being supported by Blacks and by the Indigenous, but they were really their own caste, their own group of power, no? Like,
yeah.
Yes, just that.
Thank you. There is another question just about sources. It looks like Nodia is responding to the question that was,
I just responded, yes.
Wonderful. What is a source of your data in regards to numbers coming to various countries and who kept that data? Thank you for putting that in the chat, Nodia. Let's see if there's any.
I'm just going to drop another source as well.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. We have another question. Can you speak about policies and practices still existent today that continue to exclude Afro-Latinos? For example, in Colombia, Afro-descendants were excluded from the 4-year peace process until the very last minute. Maybe Monica, can you get us started on that one? Can speak about policies and practices still existent today that continue to exclude Afro-Latinos?
Sure. Continuing to exclude and intentionally discriminate. So it's important to remember that was in 2001 in the World Conference of UN against racial discrimination. Was the first time in the history of the international law of human rights that the word Afro-descendant was included. Before that, we didn't have anything in terms of international public policy. So one example is, for example, Brazil, that is important to remember, especially because there are a lot of connections with the police brutality. Just in the first month of 2020, the police killed 3,000 people. That is like around 17 people killed per day. And in the first 6 months of the police in Rio de Janeiro, in the first 6 months, killed the same amount that in the first month of the US. So one small city of Rio has the same amount of death in 6 months that the whole the US, no? And in Rio, a Black person has 5 times more chance to die, no? So that is something important to remember, because that is a policy or like a project of the government to kill Black people. It has a lot of similarities with the US. I think that, especially in Brazil, that I am very close to Brazil now, they can kill like kids that are 6 years old, 7 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, 14 years old. So we are talking about that kind of political project, a very genocide project of the government. No? That is maybe an extreme example, but I think it's very obvious, and I want to have the opportunity to connect that with the US, because since many people here are very interested in the movement, related to the criminalization of Black people, it's important to see Brazil and to support Brazil, because there are very amazing organizations that are speaking openly about that, about these rights.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we'll take more questions, but I guess one question that I had that I would like to pose to both of you is, how do we in some ways move forward? I mean, I don't know if it's other than educating folks about the importance of Afro-Latin America with regards to seeing the connections to African Americans and African American history. My experience is that that in some ways there's been a divide and conquer strategy, if you will, among Black peoples across the Americas, and I think that people have internalized in some ways this sort of this separation in North America. And so I don't know if you feel like in both of your in some ways your lives, your careers, the work that you've done, that you've seen sort of progress, and in some ways, and I was hoping you might be able to begin to answer some of that. And then there is a question that came in, but maybe you could take a quick sort of response to that question. Go ahead, Nodia.
Um, I think that in the United States, the efforts are happening like in the individual basis. There isn't like a systemic effort. And then you said it right, education, but there is, it's more about a voluntary effort to know about Afro-descendants in Latin America. I mean, my children went to school here, and you know, they were seeing their culture was not acknowledged, even though they know what their culture is, and they were trying to talk to their friends about their culture, but it was something that it was hard to help others understand that yes, we are Black, but we have a different, not different, but we come from a culture that is different. Our experiences are different, but we share a story, a history of slavery and our descendancy and so on. But to answer your question, I think it should be more of a systematic effort rather than an individual one.
Yeah, I look forward to the day where the National Museum of African American History and Culture really features in some ways the connections across the Americas. I think that we need to have those kind of spaces that kind of can give that oomph, if you will.
That could be our next project. You know?
Yeah, let's work on it. Yeah, I do know Lonnie Bunch. I mean, he's now the president of the entire sort of kit and caboodle, and so. But Monica, have you seen? I mean, I don't. People have no idea in some ways the struggle that you've been and the leadership you've played in Peru. You know, for a time, Monica literally had bodyguards. She was in a very challenging situation, but you are also, I think, somebody who's just sort of intrinsically optimistic. Have you seen a change over the last, let's say, 15 years? That point that you feel like, you know, is there some opening now with Black Lives Matter for curiosity beyond the experiences here in North America?
Yes, of course. Otherwise, it will be difficult to continue. But I think this is something that someone can describe like historical patience. So maybe you won't get things now, but if you are conscious of the trajectory of your ancestor, you can just draw a line and just be patient. But you want a transformation in this real life, not for your children,
yes,
just for you. And I think that is something that we are seeing in Latin America. For example, after the creation of the Ministry for Racial Equity, more than 10 years ago, no, 15 years ago, we already have a good amount of Afro-Brazilians that they were able to access to higher education. That is something that we didn't have. Here in the US, we were working for many years on advocacy to include the Afro and Latino identity, no? Because before you didn't have option. You are Black or you are Latino, but you didn't have option. And there was a campaign called maybe Check Both, something like that. And after that campaign, in the previous census, we were able to include the category Black, Latino, so you have option to check more than one category. That is something that was an achievement of the movement here in the US. No, not necessarily my achievement because I was not working, I was supporting, but I was not part of the movement here.
Yeah.
But that was something important for us, for the immigrant people, and also just to define public policies, no? Because we cannot prevent gender violence, or we cannot create a cultural policies if we don't know who is who, especially in a country like the US. So that is something important that I would like to acknowledge. And we have a lot of things, but that is something that
it seems like there are a number of openings and possibilities to pursue. Wanted to also acknowledge Sifa Bulanke, where she said, she's basically saying she herself, Sifa is saying, as a Black person not well educated on the Afro-Latin American culture and history, very, very informative. I'm glad that you said that. I'll say one thing that I think that language is powerful. And when we talk about Afro-Latin or Latino culture or history in the singular, it in some ways, it's a starting point, but I always think about cultures and histories and the differences. And even though Spanish is a common language across Latin America, and there's also the Portuguese in Brazil, the kind of Spanish that's spoken is actually very different. And there's also languages like Palanquero, in Colombia, where it mixes in some ways West Central African languages with Spanish. So there's tremendous actually linguistic diversity within Latin America as well, even though there's a general lingua franca, which is Spanish. So we're coming up to about 8:25 right now, and I wanted to make sure that Beth had a chance to offer any final thoughts or comments. But before we go back to Beth, Bowles, I just wanted to say thank you very much first to those who are here as part of this conversation. Very, very, I feel very uplifted by what has been discussed over here. And really want to thank Nodia and Monica for their time and their care in terms of educating the public and the kind of work that they do every day to uplift those around them, everyone. And so thank you both for doing and leading this conversation. And I will now turn things back over to Beth. There's a couple of chats that I have to still catch up on, but Beth, thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. This was an extraordinary opportunity, I think we can all tell, with these remarkable panelists. Just thank you so much to Omar and Nodia and Monica for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. We will share, the library will share the video of the program tonight on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you'd like to rewatch it or you want to share it with someone else, that will be available. And we do hope that you will all look out for future programming from both the Greensboro Public Library and the UNCG African Americans and African Diaspora Studies Department. So we thank you all again, and we wish you a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank
Buenas
you.
noches.
Buenas noches. Buenas noches a
Ciao.
todos. Adiós.
Thank you. Thank you.